Good evening, everybody. I'm Louis Andaloro, the Vice President of the Board of the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council, and I'll be your host for this evening's program, Industrial Cannabis in the Arroyo Paredon Watershed. But first, a few announcements. This program is sponsored by the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council. We're a local 501c3 nonprofit with no paid staff. Our focus is to encourage the preservation and protection of our region's watersheds. We understand the ecological importance of having intact watersheds, and we're interested in the public health and safety issues faced by our local streams. Our goal is to educate and influence both the general public and policymakers as to the importance of our local watershed resources. Issues like water quality, fish passage, respect for our natural environment, that's what we advocate for. Please visit the Santa Barbara Urban Creek Council's website for more information about our programs and how to get involved. And you can also make a donation there. Next, I'd like to tell you about Creek Week. This is the tail end of Creek Week. It started last Saturday and it goes through tomorrow. You can Google Creek Week 2021 for a full schedule of at the City of Santa Barbara's website. And we want to send a shout out to Liz Smith, who organized the Creek Week activities this year. Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council had a forum last night on creek stewardship, and on Friday night we're having another forum on homelessness in the environment. Those programs and tonight's programs are being recorded, and you'll be able to go to our website or YouTube channel to see those later if you need to. Following the presentation of our three panelists, we're going to have a Q&A period via the chat function on Zoom, so you can type in your questions for the panelists. Next, I'm going to introduce the three panelists. First, we have Maureen Foley-Claffey. She's a writer, a farm worker, a jam maker, a mom, I added that part, and an accidental environmentalist. She founded a grassroots group, Save the Arroyo Paredon Watershed, in 2021 in order to protect this watershed, which is located next to the family's farm and avocado orchard off of Foothill Road behind Carpinteria. The proliferation of industrial cannabis, not just in her neighborhood, but throughout Carpinteria, the Carpinteria area, is severely impacting the entire community. And her noble efforts are a response to the tragic situation unfolding. She's a published author. Her writings can be found in a wide variety of periodicals, magazines, and newspapers. She's also published a novella, and she's won awards for her writing. She's currently working on a collection of essays addressing climate disasters, corporate cannabis, and the future of small-scale food farmers. Our next panelist is Elise Cossart-Daly. She's the founder and principal attorney at the Cossart-Daly Law, a unique mission-driven law practice with an emphasis on environmental advocacy, anti-discrimination, and civil rights law. She works to protect open space and wildlife habitat. She opposes irresponsible development and fights for environmental justice. She also advocates for activists and organizations working to make social changes in our society. She graduated with honors from UC Berkeley and graduated with honors from Loyola Law School. And that brings us to David Magney, our third panelist. David is a biologist and environmental consultant. Beginning in the mid-1980s, he's worked for a variety of large consulting firms before creating his own company, David Magney Environmental Consulting. He has extensive experience working in Santa Barbara County on issues such as wetlands delineation, permitting, and mitigation planning. He served as an expert witness botanist for the U.S. Department of Justice on a large wetlands violation case in Orchid, as well as on many other cases. For the past few decades, he's been involved in a variety of roles with the California Native Plant Society. In the early 90s, he was president of that organization and has been an active member in the Channel Islands chapter ever since. He now works full-time for them as the Special Projects Program Manager. He's developed and collated rare plant lists in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, and is now the leader of their project to catalog and list the local rare plants for every Santa Barbara county. With the introductions out of the way, I'm going to make a statement on behalf of the Urban Creeks Council before the panelists. When I came of age in the 1970s, cannabis was considered a dangerous drug. The penalties when caught with it were severe. Back then, it was mostly grown outdoors. It did not require huge inputs of labor, water, fertilizer, electricity, and fossil fuel like today's modern factory cannabis grows. It was grown up in the hills, not on prime ag land. It was hidden out of sight. You usually never saw it or smelled it. It had a really small carbon footprint. Things have changed with legalization. Now it's in your face. It's everywhere. It sucks up huge amounts of resources and has huge environmental impacts. The cannabis industry would like you to believe that this wholesale conversion of prime ag land into industrial cannabis production zones is simply the replacement of one ag crop for another. I don't see it that way. It's not agriculture, it's a factory. Throughout California, the proliferation of illegal grows, semi-legal grows, and legal enterprises has changed the state in a lot of negative ways. Local jurisdictions like ours are overwhelmed by the problems associated with this industry. There are lots of articles written in the local papers about illegal grows, diversion to the black market, the use of resources, the involvement of criminal elements and money laundering, and the avoidance of paying taxes and so on. The big changes to our rural neighborhoods, increased traffic, air quality issues, and the armed guards present at many sites. The list goes on. There was a July 2020 Santa Barbara grand jury report on the current cannabis ordinance. It's online at the Santa Barbara grand jury website. The grand jury was disappointed with how the ordinance was working and made numerous recommendations in their critique to the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors. The findings of the grand jury cited a host of shortcomings: the dismissal of public input, the ignoring of major environmental impacts, the influence of lobbyists. In response, the Board of Supervisors basically dismissed the findings of the report and didn't really act on any of its recommendations. So the problems we now face in the Arroyo Paredon Watershed are partially a result of the county's inadequate cannabis ordinance that really needs to be strengthened. So let's all work together to make this a better situation for all of us. Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Thank you so much, Louis. And also thank you so much to the Santa Barbara Urban Creeks Council for hosting tonight, and just for all the great support that you've provided along the way. I was going to start out the conversation, I believe, Elise, we talked about it with just kind of a background of how I got involved with the creek and this particular project. Does that sound about right? So I call myself an accidental environmental activist because that wasn't really the plan, so to speak. I probably most environmental activists, I would guess, probably find themselves in this situation. But I worked it out with my mom today, 6th generation Carpinteria farmer. So our family came to Carpinteria in the 1860s, and we've been farming continuously in the Carpinteria Valley since then. During that time, we've seen a variety of crops. Farming is very cyclical. So, initially it was hay and horses and cattle. Lima beans actually were the first big commercial crop in Carpinteria, little known fact. So if you hate lima beans, blame Carpinteria. Lemons, walnuts, etc. And cannabis is kind of the latest thing. Our family now grows avocados. So basically what happened in my situation is I was living on our family farm. My daughter was about 5. And the first really big change to our neighborhood was the mudslide, the Thomas fire, and then the mudslide. I was evacuated for the fire, and then our house was hit and impacted by the mudslide. And that was a hugely disruptive and uncomfortable thing. It also really sparked my interest in this creek in Arroyo Paredon, because I'd always played in the creek and admired the creek, and the creek had really been a part of my experience of my childhood and the farm and everything around it. But I'd never really researched it or do you know what I mean? I'd never had an adult understanding of it. So the mudslide and the fire forced me to acknowledge my piece in the ecosystem, if that makes sense. And I became really interested in the creek and why did our creek flood and why did our house get hit by the mudslide and not other places? So I started my learning with the creek. As that was happening, I didn't know this at the time, but literally the county Board of Supervisors was crafting their cannabis ordinance first during the fire, and then it was subsequently approved during the mudslide. So I think that's really important to point out because a lot of our cannabis problems, they're man-made disasters. And it reminds me a lot of Hurricane Katrina. We think of Hurricane Katrina as a natural disaster. It was actually a man-made disaster tacked onto the back of a natural disaster. So I think there's a lot of ways that this is a topic for another time, but I think our climate disasters are lending themselves into man-made disasters. I think this is good. We're going to see this play out over and over again. So as after the mudslide, our little bridge was closed on Foothill Road. And that's when I started noticing the real changes with the cannabis farm. So fast forward to now, a company called Cresco is in the final planning stages of a massive industrial cannabis operation next to our farm. And there have been like countless intrusive problems that have resulted from that cannabis farm being there. And I guess the reason I've become an activist is because I've taken the time and the effort to document those problems and then ask the county to respond to those problems. Not only the county, but really any agency that will listen to me. And the bottom line is where we're at now, one of the few mechanisms that's left to address the problems being dealt with at the county is through the planning process.
And I can jump in and talk a little bit about where we are in the land use process. So right. In my work as an attorney, one of the things that I do is I advocate for the environment and primarily in land use processes. So in this case, Cresco is located in, I just want to kind of orient us in the kind of legal field because there is a legal avenue a legal aspect with respect to this. So Cresco is located in unincorporated Santa Barbara County. And in order for Cresco to run a cannabis operation, they had to apply for a permit from the county planning department. And it's the county's job to make sure that the project complies with their rules about cannabis and development projects before they allow Cresco to move forward with it. The County Planning Commission reviewed the project in early August. Basically, Cresco came and applied to the county, and then the Planning Commission reviewed their application. In the middle of this process, Cresco proposed significant changes to the project with respect to the way they were going to try to mitigate odor. Rather than using a buyer's vapor phase system, which basically attempts to mitigate odors by spraying a chemical blend along the roofs of the greenhouses, Cresco proposed that they use a brand new, previously undeveloped carbon scrubbing system, where carbon scrubbers, which are basically tall devices, they almost look like big trash cans, are spread throughout the greenhouse where they're growing cannabis, and they aim to filter the air in the greenhouse. This is in opposition to what we were requesting, which is the best available technology, which is a carbon filtration system. So odor is a huge issue. And when a project is located near a creek, the impacts of odor on sensitive species have yet to be studied. So it's really important that we provide the best available technology to deal with the cannabis odor. The Planning Commission, so because of this proposal, the Planning Commission held a second hearing at the beginning of September to basically deliberate on the new technology. And at that meeting, the county approved the project. The next step in this process, if people are concerned about the project, is to appeal the project to the Board of Supervisors. If there's no appeal, then the Planning Commission's decision is final and they can just go ahead with the project. So Maureen, her family farm, and Save Arroyo Paredon Watershed appealed the commission's approval to the Board of Supervisors. And the Board of Supervisors is going to review the appeal and then schedule and hold a hearing on the project where they will make a final decision.
So, so the project, Cresco's project, like the majority of the projects in Carpinteria, specifically in an area that realtors are now calling the cannabis zone, which is this rectangle, approximately, very small rectangle, I don't know exactly how small, but between Nightyver and Cravens Lane in Carpinteria and Foothill Road and Via Real. There's a massive concentration of cannabis farms, either legal non-conforming and already in operation or being proposed. And in the bulk of those, what they're doing is the operators are taking dilapidated greenhouses that were designed to grow flowers that are partially vented, meaning they're not fully enclosed and they're not fully open. They're kind of somewhere in between. They're closed most of the time and can be opened as needed. So that's where Cresco is located. And then Cresco, even more specifically, is located literally like on the banks of Arroyo Paredon. And it's the greenhouses that's being built were designed for building flowers and were built in approximately the 1960s, then sort of added on without permits. And now what they're proposing is a massive kind of re-envisioning, including a 2-story industrial office / processing site. And we know the processing sites are even smellier than the grows. So this 2-story processing site that's going to be so intensive in terms of usage, that's now requiring 2 new septic tanks that are going to be dug on the edge of the creek. 75 employees, 7 days a week. So all of the parking from that, all the runoff from that, not to mention the traffic involved with deliveries and picking up and in addition, in this very short span, so Arroyo Paredon, or so Cresco is basically at Foothill. Arroyo Paredon runs out to the sea at Padaro Lane. And there's, I think, 3 other cannabis operations in the works just in that short, I want to say about 1 mile that the creek runs out to the sea. So it's incredibly intense.
And what I would mention is what they're proposing is an expansion of the existing greenhouse to do 6 acres of cannabis grow. So the greenhouse is actually going to be the size of 6 acres. It's located directly basically adjacent to the creek. Part of that greenhouse is the county has laid out an environmentally sensitive habitat buffer. So an ESH buffer, which David may comment on, may be insufficient in and of itself. The buffer may not be large enough, but part of the greenhouse, that large 6-acre greenhouse with cannabis grow, is going to be within and exists within that ESH buffer. So it exists within this environmentally sensitive habitat area buffer. And as part of the project application, or part of the project in the development, there was an existing avocado orchard there that served as kind of an extension of and part of the ESH buffer where, sensitive species might nest. David can speak to this a little bit more. And as part of the development, they destroyed that avocado orchard in order to move forward with the project. So what you're looking at is a 6-acre grow within a partially vented greenhouse that's on the edge of Arroyo Paredon Creek, which supports a number of rare and endangered species. David, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit about the sensitive species there and some of the impacts of the project?
All right, so what I look at on projects like this, and in all projects, in fact, is what biological resources are present, how might they be affected, both directly and indirectly. Anytime we have our stream corridor, riparian habitat, or any wetland type, I look at what functions does that wetland have, and how well is it functioning? Are many of our streams that are in conditions like this, where they're bounded by urban development or agriculture, whatnot, are usually heavily impacted. Even though the stream itself might not be, there's usually almost no buffer. And so there's a lot of indirect effects that are imposed on the functions of the wetlands. And all wetlands have a number of different functions that are broken down into three basic types, physical, chemical, and biological. One of the things in CEQA, we usually are focusing on the biological resource components, not so much the physical or chemical components, even though they are absolutely vital, important components of how wetlands function. The county recognizes, many counties do, Santa Barbara County recognizes that they are important habitats. And in the general plan, they set up buffer zones to protect those resources. In this county, Santa Barbara County, it's 50 feet in urban areas and 100 feet in rural areas. And the reality is those are absolute minimum numbers for a number of functions. Whatever happens next to our streams has an effect, either directly or indirectly. And so what activities are happening, it makes a big difference. It can be quite complex, all the different functions and how they're working or not working. This creek, as many of the creeks in Carpinteria Valley, provide habitat for rare species. Some of them are listed. It is a steelhead stream. Caltrans has spent a lot of money retrofitting bridge crossings and creek crossings so that the steelhead can migrate up the stream. It's the riparian habitat provides habitat for least-billed vireo, not least-billed vireo. Yes, least-billed vireo and yellow warblers, a lot of riparian species. Willow flycatcher is another listed species. It's habitat for red-legged frog, southwestern pond turtle, which is not listed, but it's a sensitive species. There's a whole slew of wildlife that depend on the creek, not just entirely for their life cycle, but for a portion of it. So the number of species that depend on our streams like Arroyo Paredon is very extensive. So in evaluating any of these projects, you want to minimize, first avoid all the impacts that you can. Here we have we had an existing avocado orchard and greenhouses. Those had effects on the wetland resources, mostly indirectly. Originally, the riparian habitat was much more extensive, and it worked in lockstep with the adjacent upland habitats that were here before agriculture and any sort of development. So having adequate buffers is really a necessary component so that what is left can still function very well. Santa Barbara County is fortunate to have had a model developed specifically for riparian streams to assess wetland functions. It gets quite technical, but basically scientists went out and measured all these different variables in the streams on the south coast front of Santa Barbara County, and then identify which ones are in perfect condition, and we measure that by have humans affected them. If the humans have not altered them, they're at pristine conditions, and they're considered reference standards. And so then we compare all our streams according to those conditions. And you got to recognize too that we have lots of different components of our streams. Different reaches have different characters. Very steep streams with very narrow valleys, maybe bedrock. And then down in the valley here, we have a lot of alluvium. It's a different system, but the water's flowing through and the habitats are there functioning in certain ways and transporting nutrients downstream into the ocean. Some species migrate up, like the steelhead and tidewater goby. So there's a number of species that use all this complex habitat, but when we start narrowing it down and dumping stuff into it, polluting the stream, it has a really negative effect. And what we end up is a bunch of endangered species, and some of them go extinct. So when I'm looking at projects like this, you're not proposing to do anything in the stream. Well, that's good. But whatever you do next to it still has an effect. And sometimes we don't know what that effect is. There was one study that the Napa County commissioned to analyze what kind of buffer was necessary for the Napa River. Now, of course, Napa River is much larger than Arroyo Paredon, but it's still the same basic idea. And that study found that there is a lot of different buffer distances that are needed, buffer widths that are needed depending on which resource you're trying to protect. Some birds require over a mile of pristine habitat between the stream. And plants usually require a lot less, depending on the species. So it can be quite complex. And so we want to figure out what is the right balance that we're going to do development. We're going to have various activities that we need to live here. How do we do it so that we're not adversely affecting the environment? This project here, they did not analyze indirect impacts at all. That's a concern to me. No, you need to look at what all the impacts are. Staying out of the creek is certainly good. And as Elise mentioned, there's the odor issues. We don't know what effect that will have on wildlife. There was a long time, James Audubon thought that birds couldn't smell. Well, that's not true. So there are some that are much more sensitive than others, and maybe they can't stand the smell of cannabis. Some of us don't like it, some of us don't mind, but it can have effect. Just like sound and light can all affect these different species. And unless we study them, we don't know what the effect is. So to me, it's better to err on the side of caution. And there, certainly like Ventura County has ordinances where, for wildlife, you can't shine any lights to your natural habitats. You can't shine lights to the sky. You hood all your lights. You have low lumens. And during construction, you minimize the amount of noise and the timing of it when bird nests are active and things like that. And so there's lots and lots of components that we need to figure out and analyze. And we expect our decision makers to actually do that kind of analysis. And it's frustrating when they actually don't, they poo-poo it. One thing that I thought was interesting on this particular project is, there was an avocado orchard, portion of it. And regardless of what anybody says, they still provide habitat. They are used by birds and wildlife. And because we're not looking and not measuring it, doesn't mean that it's not happening. Every tree provides structure, which is habitat. And if we highly manage them, well, then we're going to reduce the number of species that can use them. And also the habitat underneath, especially in this case, it was unmanaged. So that means you probably had lots of different wildlife species that were using that habitat, even though it was narrow. It was right next to the creek. So that connection means it was an extension of the riparian habitat, even though it was managed. What was disturbing to me about it is that they went and removed it without any consideration. So, they had mitigation measures, which are standard that, we'll go out and survey, make sure there's no active bird nest before any construction happens and things like that. Those are all normal and good things to do, but none of that happened here. They just went in and removed the trees. There could have been many bird nests that were destroyed. We will never know. And it's actually a violation of Fish and Game Code. You're not allowed to disturb any active bird nests. Well, if you don't look. So there's lots of, the biggest thing I found about this project was the indirect effects that were basically not analyzed. And I recommended that they use that model, which is called hydrogeomorphic assessment method. And you can look it up at the county. It's flood control that paid for it. I'm surprised that the county doesn't use it more. I've used it as a consultant many times on a number of projects, and it works great as providing an objective means of analyzing indirect and direct impacts. But many people don't use it, and that's frustrating. I found it to be a useful tool also on projects to identify, okay, what can we do to improve conditions in our creeks? Like removing invasive exotics and planting some natives, and just some minor things that really make a big difference for the functionality of our creeks. And so it's a tool that can be used very effectively throughout for all our creeks in Santa Barbara County. It's there. It's not that hard to use. It takes some training, but it's logical and, like I say, it's objective, as opposed to, in my opinion, this project has no effect or it has lots of effect. That's just, and everybody's opinion varies. So that's why I like using models like the HGM model is it reduces my own bias. And I'm very biased. I'm an environmentalist. I've been an environmentalist ever before I got into consulting. I find that consulting helps me help clients minimize their impacts. And then sometimes I'm hired to actually critically review other people's projects and hopefully make it better so that the project isn't bad. Anyway.
David, thank you so much. It's just so wonderful to hear you kind of talk about all these complicated things in such a simple and straightforward way. I really, really appreciate it. And I just wanted to jump in here, Elise, unless there was something else that you felt like we should add, but I wanted to kind of draw some lines outward to why this creek is important and why this specific situation matters. So our little, like I was talking with Elise earlier, and she called it a case study. So the situation in Cresco in Carpinteria is kind of the tip of the iceberg for Santa Barbara County in terms of this cannabis zone and Carpinteria and the 180 acre cap that we're looking at. So Cresco, although it's gigantic, it's 6 acres in greenhouses, we're looking at 180 additional permitted acres just in Carpinteria. And that was an arbitrary cap that was just assigned. So I think it's really important what I was saying about a man-made disaster. I've studied and looked not like in an in-depth way, but just to get some perspective, I've looked at some other California counties and what they've done. And basically, Santa Barbara County is far, far, far outside the norm of how cannabis was dealt with. So once cannabis was legalized recreationally by the state left it to the counties to decide, create policy around how they were going to roll things out. No pun intended there. So Santa Barbara took this kind of far, far, far sort of open approach that's now presented us with a lot of problems. And so I think for me, this has been a really steep learning curve in terms of how environmental policy on the front end of a new industry can have really, really intensive impacts, sometimes maybe unintended consequences, but incredible. The good news about it being a man-made problem in some ways is that men and women can also fix it. So I think the biggest shock for me was learning about something called a programmatic EIR, which is a very boring thing, but it's basically, my understanding, and Elise can correct me, but it's basically Santa Barbara County chose to exempt, to pass one document that said, okay, cannabis projects, if you go through this checklist, you're going to be sort of exempt from rigid and in-depth environmental review just because you're cannabis. And that, by passing that, again, that was approved just after the mudslide, when literally Carpinteria's freeways were barely open again. My road was closed, like I couldn't go north on foothills. So, but that one piece has made it very, very hard as an environmental activist to get environmental changes happening on these projects. So anyways, what I'm trying to say is this situation, Cresco, is a case study for Carpinteria, but in a much bigger picture, this is all a case study for California and also for the country as recreational pot gets rolled out, again, no pun intended, across the country. I think understanding that, I think following the example of some other counties that have taken a much more conservative approach, not conservative in terms of their politics, like Santa Cruz County, Humboldt County actually have imposed acreage caps. Like, so you have a 200-acre farm, only a percentage of that 200 acres can be cannabis. Anyways, there's a whole list of ways in which it was understood from day one that smell would be an issue in Santa Cruz County, right? Like, that was the number one concern. Santa Barbara County doesn't even have an air quality element in their programmatic EIR, which I thought had been, naively, I had thought that was an oversight when I first began this work. And I now realize was a deliberate choice made by our supervisors to basically kick the can down the road and make it not the county, try to make it not the county's problem, which is just very bizarre. So the bottom line for me,
that could be a benefit in that if it wasn't addressed in the programmatic EIR, then they have to address it subsequently.
Right.
Programmatic EIR, to me,
right.
are a problem because they usually gloss over most issues.
Right.
So I think that the theme here, the thesis is that this is like Maureen said, a case study of what's happening with cannabis and on a broader scale, and particularly with respect to Santa Barbara County. The main issue is that the county really hasn't, and I'll just say it, the county hasn't done their job in ensuring that the environment is protected and that human health is protected with a new industry. They haven't done it. They haven't been sufficiently careful with respect to the way that they've crafted their ordinances. The PEIR, the programmatic EIR, is insufficient. It doesn't sufficiently analyze the impacts or provide mitigation measures or provide systems or provide checks and balances to ensure that these projects are sufficiently studied and then environmental impacts are sufficiently mitigated. And the fact that this project is located on the edge of this really important riparian habitat that supports endangered and sensitive species just really illustrates the concern, and the very valid concern, that citizens like Maureen and Save Arroyo Paredon Watershed have raised. So I just want to kind of orient us in the legal framework. So typically with land use issues, if you want to develop a property, if you want to use a property in a different way than it's currently being used, you have to go through a public agency to get a permit. And typically, when you go through a public agency to get a permit, and I'm keeping this very broad, the California Environmental Quality Act, which is called CEQA, applies. And CEQA has kind of a two-pronged approach. One is to ensure that environmental impacts are identified and potentially mitigated. And two, to ensure that the public has the right of participation and that the public can participate in the process. They can work alongside the developer and the public agency to look at how this project is going to impact the environment, figure out solutions as to how we can mitigate those impacts, and be able to know what's going on and what the public agency is approving. So with the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which I'm going to just call it CEQA. With CEQA, you have to do certain levels of environmental analysis. Typically, there's an initial study. It's kind of a first step environmental analysis. And then if the project may have a significant impact on the environment, you have to do an environmental impact report. And this is a little bit jargony, but an EIR, and forgive me if I'm making this too basic, but an EIR essentially is supposed to ensure that the project analyzes all those environmental impacts. As Maureen was kind of foreshadowing here, what happened in this context is that the county created what's called a programmatic EIR, which is an EIR that's kind of like a big, broad umbrella for a whole bunch of different projects or things that are being done. And that EIR was incredibly deficient. It really didn't look at cumulative impacts, which means the impacts of not just one project, but the fact that they were going to have all these projects stacked on top of each other. There are certain aspects of the EIR that are just insufficient. They don't look sufficiently at what the impacts are going to be. And the real downside of a programmatic EIR is it doesn't look at each individual project. It makes broad generalizations for projects all throughout the county. And as we know, as Santa Barbara County residents, what happens in Carpinteria and the landscape there and the air quality and the cold air inversion and all of these factors are significantly different from, say, Santa Maria or from the San Ynez Valley. We have all these microclimates and we have all these different environmental factors. In addition, when you put a project in right next to a creek that has sensitive species and rare and endangered species, it's going to have very different impacts than if you put a project, say, in the middle of the foothills where there's no riparian habitat nearby. Very different circumstances and situations. So in this case, what happened is they had this programmatic EIR. And so Maureen and I actually, and Concerned Carpinterians, worked on this several years ago on challenging the programmatic EIR with respect to a number of projects. And we have colleagues who are also advocates working in the community who have challenged projects under the PEIR. And unfortunately, the county, it just falls on deaf ears. The county is very attached to the PEIR, and they don't want to do any subsequent environmental analysis under CEQA for other projects. They don't want to look at specific project impacts. That's just something that hasn't been successful in front of the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors, frankly, no matter how good the arguments are or how good the evidence is. So unfortunately, that's the situation that we find ourselves in. What the PEIR looked at was the cannabis ordinance itself. So the regulations that the county was going to put in place for cannabis projects. And basically what it said was, okay, well, these regulations are good under this PEIR. And this is what we're going to use as standards to look at the specific impacts of projects. David, I see your hand up.
Did anybody challenge the PEIR?
So because I don't know if anyone filed suit, I don't think so. And the fact is, because it happened in the middle of all these natural disasters, and it has this very short statute of limitations, we looked at this. Was there a way to go back? There was not. I don't think anyone filed. To my knowledge, no one filed.
I was digging out my front yard. The bridge was closed.
Yeah.
I was traumatized. We literally didn't even know what was going on. None of these leaders, no one reached out to us. It wasn't in the newspapers. It was just, by the time we realized what had happened, that I think the 3-month statute of limitations had passed and we were done.
Well, it's 30 days after they filed notice of determination, 3 months if they don't file determination. That's one thing that most people don't know is that, there's a very narrow window which you can challenge an EIR. After that, it's the law.
It's done. So we're stuck. Yeah, in a lot of ways, David, we're stuck with it. The best argument. Go ahead.
And a lot of people don't know too is that the only body that enforces CEQA is the public. There's no agency responsible for that. So there's nobody looking for the county except the people. And you need to file a lawsuit. You have to participate and then file a challenge during a very narrow window. It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
We like this.
It's really designed to prioritize developers and to discourage public participation. Maureen, jump on in, but I do want to make sure I come back to the statute of limitations and the requirements for participation, just so that people, it's not legal advice. I'm bound by certain ethical rules. So I have to say, this is not legal advice. I'm not your lawyer, but I can talk to you a little bit about the difficulty and what you need to think about if you want to challenge a project, so that you have that in your back pocket if you come across this in the future.
Just because we're kind of getting to the end of things, I also want to just jump on, there's a PEIR problem. I think I've never I've never felt so frustrated in my life, because there's all these different human man-made points where changes could happen and they're just not. So, I mean, obviously the bottom line is air and water pollution. That's where we're at. The air is polluted. The water is potentially going to get polluted in the creek. That's where we're at. And those seem like really basic things, but the big piece that's missing is there is no accountability or enforcement at the county level. So from my standpoint, as a neighbor, as a farmer, as a human being in this environment. So as it stands right now, I can stand on Foothill Road and I can look across the creek and I can see the cannabis being grown in greenhouses that have no walls. And I have called and told the county this, and I can see the greenhouses with no walls. That's what they're called by the county. The county did an inspection. They said, yes, they're growing cannabis in greenhouses with no walls. Yes, they're not allowed to do that because they're not supposed to grow outside of greenhouses in Carpinteria, but it's fine because they're legal non-conforming. So there's all these loopholes. And so why do we care if pot's being grown that we can see by the creek? Because we know possums can get in there, raccoons can get in there. We have deer along the creek, mountain lions, all these animals. We have no idea how this plant is going to affect the ecosystem, not only the smell, but the actual plant itself. And it just, when you make a smell complaint, I think there's like over 400 smell complaints that have been made approximately for this particular project. Nothing has happened. So again, there's a way in which the speed of the passage of these projects is exceeding the speed of the enforcement or rules for enforcement, and or there's the message of just don't bother enforcing these things. I'm not sure. I don't know why. But what I'm telling you as a human being living in this environment is that it's the most excruciatingly challenging thing to be living next door and just, you know, you're living in Santa Barbara County, the birthplace of the environmental movement, where, you know, typically you can't even build an outhouse without somebody complaining, right? Or having to get 16 permits. And at every step, this massive project has been seemingly given a pass. And you just want, yeah. So sometimes I feel like the adult in the room, and I don't want to feel like that because I'm just one human, you know?
So with the case of the programmatic EIR, at this point, the only way to change it is you have to become very political and threaten the continued representation by your supervisors. They're the ones that have the ability to change it. They can require that a new EIR be done, or update the general plan and change some of these conditions. And the only way that's going to happen is through political pressure, because we don't have legal challenges except for project by project now.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So that, and I think you both make very good points with respect to this. Going back to the statute of limitations with CEQA, and then I want to talk specifically about this project and what tools are available for this project and for other projects in Santa Barbara County. So with respect to CEQA, David made a very good point. If you want to challenge a project, now this isn't really available for cannabis, but let's say there is and again, not legal advice, there is a creek that has a development near it that you're concerned about it being threatened. It's very important that you participate in the public process. There will be hearings. It is important that you send letters in those hearings, that you show up and speak at those hearings, that you write emails to your local representatives. So you have both a legal avenue where you participate in the hearings, you state your concerns on the record. If you think you might file a lawsuit, you hire an attorney that specializes in CEQA, and you hire an expert like David. This is not an advertisement, but I'm serious. You hire an expert to pack the record so that you have good evidence to show what the county or city is doing is incorrect. You have to appeal everything. You have to appeal it to the highest administrative body, which is in Santa Barbara, the city council, or in the county, it's the board of supervisors. So you have to go through each step of the process. And then you have a very short statute of limitations. It depends on basically what the city or county does under CEQA. The statute of limitations varies based on that, but to be safe, I would just assume it's 30 days because that's the shortest, and it is very short. In most other actions, I do civil rights and discrimination work, you know, it's several years. So this is a really short time period. Now, in this particular context, CEQA is less available to us because it hasn't been as effective. There's currently litigation pending on a project filed by some of our colleagues, which had a loss at the trial court level and hopefully will be appealed. But it challenged the way that the PEIR, the programmatic EIR, is being applied to individual projects. In this case, the tool that we have is the Santa Barbara County Cannabis Ordinance, or the actual rules that the county put into place with respect to cannabis. And so we are utilizing those tools to make really good arguments about why in this particular case, there needs to be more environmental analysis and why this project just isn't right here. That is what's available in other cannabis projects as well, is to rely on what the ordinance says. And in this case, like Maureen said, there's two big pieces. There's the creek and the creek habitat, and there's air quality. One of the things that the cannabis ordinance requires, this is located in the coastal zone, and the coastal zone is a strip of land that's along the coast throughout California. And in the coastal zone, you're supposed to have even more protection for the environment. So there's a specific set of rules in the coastal zone. And in order to approve the project, the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors has to find that the project complies with the rules and requirements for the coastal zone. One of those rules and requirements is that you have to have a habitat protection plan. If something is in the environmentally sensitive habitat buffer, and if it might have impacts on sensitive species, they don't have it here. And they've claimed that there aren't impacts on sensitive species, but as David has laid out very well, they simply haven't done their research. They haven't provided enough information to support that kind of a conclusion or finding. And the next thing is with respect to the air quality. They're proposing that they use an entirely new system, air quality mitigation system. That's great. I love innovation. I think moving towards carbon scrubbers is great. They've proposed carbon scrubbers, but they haven't tested this. And one of the requirements under the cannabis ordinance is that someone certifies that it's the best available technology. And we simply don't have the data or evidence to show that here. So those are some of the issues with this particular case. And this is the legal framework that we're utilizing to really push for environmental protection, both with respect to the creek and with respect to the air. And this can be extrapolated out to other projects in the county. You'll use the cannabis ordinance to make arguments about environmental protection because CEQA, frankly, hasn't really been available to us. Now, like I've said, there is a next step here. We're waiting to go to the Board of Supervisors. Maureen, Save Arroyo Paredon Watershed, and her family farm have appealed the project to the Board of Supervisors. If you are interested in working to save Arroyo Paredon Watershed and support the cause, we would love to have you on board. You can reach out to Lewis and the Urban Creeks Council to get in touch with Maureen and get on the mailing list. She'll provide updates with respect to when this will be heard. But like David said, petitioning your elected representatives is the way to go. This is what we need to do. We need both legal pressure through these individual projects, and we need political pressure simultaneously. We need to make it really important to the county to do the right thing with respect to the environment in cannabis projects, to do their due diligence, to make sure that the environment is protected. So for this specific case, if you reach out to the Board of Supervisors about it, both now and when it goes to hearing, that's fantastic. If you can write letters and make public comment at the hearing, if you have the means, if you can donate to Save Arroyo Paredon Watershed, That's fantastic. And then on the broader level, you know, it's continuing to apply political pressure to make sure that there are more stringent rules around protecting the environment in this new industry. Is there anything anyone wanted to add?
Hey, this is Sarah Triguero. I'm dialed in by phone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. Obviously very much support this effort, and I'm appealing a similar development down the road. And I just wanted to let the group know that one of the neat things about being in the coastal zone and being in proximity to an environmentally sensitive habitat is that these situations, to the extent the Board of Supervisors does not see the light, are appealable to the Coastal Commission. And, you know, in terms of the politics of the supervisors versus the Coastal Commission, it's an entirely different set of people who can opt to hear it basically at that point in time. And I certainly hope they do if it comes to that.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Sarah.
that's a good point that there's an extra level of appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I was going to just make a quick point too, which is that I think I want to come back to the mudslide and the fire and Arroyo Paredon sort of making itself known in my psyche, and maybe in the psyche of a lot of us. It closed the freeway, actually, Arroyo Paredon and Carpinteria. So, but that is that I have now seen myself as a part of an ecosystem, which is a watershed. And I've found all these great online tools that are free and government resources. And I've seen that all of the creeks in Carpinteria are labeled as, David Magney could probably tell me the name, like impacted, or
Yep.
Is that the word? Yeah, so basically, yeah, all the creeks in Carpinteria are compromised, including the salt marsh. And I think that brings me back to the realization that even if these greenhouses aren't cannabis, they're still industrial farming. And I don't think that they ever should have been built alongside these creeks or in such proximity to the salt marsh, which is this incredible resource. Like, I mean, treasure, actually, absolute treasure. So I think my bigger understanding is that I've had to find a way towards love. You know, activism has to be, you have to really love it because it's exhausting and tireless and unpaid. But I love Arroyo Paredon Creek. I love it dearly. I love it. I love Santa Claus Beach where it runs out. I mean, I get goosebumps. I've made all my biggest life decisions on that beach, near the creek mouth. And so I love that creek. I love my watershed. I love Carpinteria Valley. And that is what's motivating me to forward, you know. But I think without examining and understanding greenhouses as industrial farming, that may not really be compatible in the coastal zone anymore. I know that's a much larger question, but I think with global warming and climate change and flood zones changing and flooding changing, that's kind of where my heart and work is leading out, regardless of what happens with this specific project, although I'm still fighting very hard to do our best by it. And I think what's also interesting and hard is that it's not like we can look at other cases and see what they did or how they fix things, because it's all pretty new. There's so much that they don't know about how cannabis affects our environment and our ecosystem, because it was a class 1 drug. It wasn't allowed to be studied in a way. So I think that's another cautionary tale for communities, like, wait for the science to catch up before you roll out this technology in our environment. We know that's why for me, this is a little bit like big oil 2.0. We thought, oh, this is fine. And then it really wasn't fine. So that's kind of all that I'm saying. And yeah, I hope that people will reach out to the Urban Creeks Council and get involved with their local creek and contact me if they'd like to be involved. And, you know, I've learned so much in this fight. I'm sure there are a lot of other people in Santa Barbara County that are looking at these behemoth multi-million/billion-dollar cannabis corporations and just thinking, like, what's the point? It's a done deal. And luckily I'm a 6th-generation farmer in Carpinteria Valley and know, you know, what was walnuts yesterday could be lima beans tomorrow. So it's a, you know, it's a long game, and hopefully we can make this industry accountable and better. And if it doesn't smell bad and it's not polluting the water, it's not going to be a problem. So.
As Maureen pointed out, the water quality issues in all the creeks in the Carpinteria Valley has been actually an issue for decades, and primarily because of the improper discharge practices of the cut flower greenhouse industry in the valley. Huge nitrogen loads, and as well as other pesticides and other nutrients that directly and indirectly affected the Carpinteria salt marsh, which is extremely valuable biological resource. And so, you know, one was UCSB. That was always an issue, you know, that I know Wayne Farron was the curator of the museum of the herbarium at the time and manager of the UC preserve at Carpinteria. And that was always an issue to work with the farmers growing the cut flowers to help deal with that problem. And this is just another example where there's potential impact and it needs to be addressed up front. And not, we need to protect our creeks, improve conditions for them, not have additional impacts on them.
Yeah.
I also just wanted to add that for people watching the program, the problems of Arroyo Paredon Creek are not unique to this creek watershed. I think part of what makes it unique is that there's a lot of people living around it. When you look at the North County, you know, Orchid, Santa Maria, Lompoc, and those areas where it's much more agriculture, not nearly as many homes in the area, I think you're going to see that those effects are going to be much larger than what we're seeing here. So it's not just an Arroyo Paredon problem, it's a countywide problem and a statewide problem.
And the what's interesting is the illegal cannabis farming, or you know, the problems associated with creeks and illegal cannabis farming have been documented for years in the sense of illegal diversion of water flow and erosion. And I know that was part of a problem in there's a canyon where there's a lot of stuff happening in North County, and I can't remember the name of it, but there was documented creek erosion and problems like that. So that's like an additional problem too, you know, is diversion of the water, that whole thing.
Yeah, there are some streams in Northern California where the streams have gone dry because of the diversion. And then all the chemicals that they were using were polluting the streams too and killing the fisheries as well. It's a huge problem.
And we haven't really gotten any questions, and it's 8:15, so I think we should probably wrap it up. Does anybody want to say anything, a final word before we sign off?
Thank you so much for hosting this. It was such a pleasure, and yeah, thank you for your work.
Yeah, and come visit Arroyo Paredon Creek. It's a beautiful place. You've probably passed it 1,000 times if you've driven the back roads between Carpinteria and Santa Barbara, but next time stop and take a look.
And get active if you're not, and stay active if you are, because it's our resources.
Yeah.
And we live here and we have to take care of it.
Yeah.
Okay, and as a final word, let me just say that anybody who's watching this program who's interested in contacting anybody, just contact the Urban Creeks Council through our website, and we'll forward any information to the panelists. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating. Have a wonderful night, and good night.